It is 2008, somewhere in rural Minnesota, and a 21-year-old named Brandon Swanson is on the phone with his father. Brandon had crashed his car into a ditch earlier that night, and he was walking through the dark trying to find his way to a town. His father, Brian, was on the other end of the line, talking him through it, keeping him calm. They had been on the phone for almost an hour. Brandon said he could see lights ahead. He thought he was close to a town. And then, mid-sentence, in the middle of a word, Brandon said something that made no sense. He said the word hell as part of a sentence he did not finish, and the line went silent, not the silence of a dropped call. The call was still connected. Brian kept saying his son's name into the phone. Brandon never answered. The call stayed open for another minute and a half. There was no sound, not a splash, not a thud, not a cry, nothing. Brandon Swanson was 21 years old. He was on the phone with his father, and between one word and the next, he was gone. His body has never been found. There is no explanation that accounts for all the facts. And this is not the strangest disappearance in this story. People go missing every day. The statistics are large and they are mostly explicable. People leave voluntarily. People have accidents in remote locations. People are harmed by other people. The machinery of disappearance, most of the time, has an explanation somewhere in it, even when that explanation takes years to find. But there exists a category of disappearance that resists explanation at a more fundamental level. Cases where the circumstances themselves are impossible. Where the evidence points in directions that cannot all be true simultaneously. Where the person was there, verifiably, demonstrably there, and then was not, and nothing in the physical record accounts for the transition. These cases are not unsolved in the ordinary sense of the word. They are unsolved in a way that challenges the assumption that solutions exist. In October 1978, a 20-year-old Australian pilot named Frederick Valentik took off from Melbourne in a single-engine Cessna 102 for a short flight across the Bass Strait. He was experienced enough for the route. The weather was clear, and the flight should have taken under an hour. At 7:06 p.m., Valentik radioed Melbourne Air Traffic Control and reported something unusual. He said there was an aircraft above him that he could not identify. The controller checked and confirmed that no other aircraft were in the area. Valentik described it as long, with a shiny metal surface and a green light. It was orbiting above him. He reported that his engine had begun running roughly. At 7:12 p.m., the radio transmission ended with 6 seconds of a metallic scraping sound that has never been identified. Valentik, his aircraft, and whatever he was describing were never found. The Bass Strait was searched extensively. No wreckage, no body, no debris field, no trace of any kind on the surface of the water or beneath it. The Australian Department of Transport investigation concluded, with the cause of the accident listed as unknown. The controller who spoke to Valentik in those final minutes later said that what struck him most was not what Valentik said, but how he said it. He was not panicking, he was curious. He described whatever was above him the way a person describes something genuinely puzzling, not something terrifying. Whatever Valentik saw in his last minutes was strange enough to report and calm enough not to run from. And then the scraping sound, and then nothing. Brandon Swanson's case has a different texture. There is no strangeness in the circumstances leading up to the disappearance. A car in a ditch, a dark road, a phone call. These are ordinary things. The strangeness is entirely in the moment of the disappearance itself. The call stayed connected after Brandon stopped speaking. Investigators who analyzed the call could find no sound consistent with a fall, a collapse, or an impact. The area where Brandon was believed to be walking was searched by hundreds of volunteers over multiple days, with dogs and aerial support. The Canby Police Department, the Sheriff's Office, the State Patrol all participated. 5 years later, a partial remains discovery in a river some distance from where Brandon had described himself as being suggested he had fallen into water, but the location was inconsistent with his description of where he was, and the circumstances of the fall, if it was a fall, could not be reconstructed. The phone call remains the most studied element of the case. Audio analysts have examined the final seconds repeatedly. There is the word, there is the partial word, and there is silence. No one has produced a satisfactory account of how a person speaking on a phone can transition in the middle of a syllable to complete and permanent silence without producing any intermediate sound. Ambrose Bierce was one of the most famous writers in America in 1913. He was 71 years old. He had spent decades as a journalist and satirist, and he had survived the Civil War with what his contemporaries described as almost supernatural composure under fire. In October 1913, he left Washington, D.C. and traveled south through the old Civil War battlefields he had fought on 50 years before, writing letters that his correspondents later described as unusually reflective in tone. He crossed into Mexico, which was at that time in the middle of a revolution. His last confirmed letter was written from Chihuahua in late December 1913. In it, he wrote words that have been quoted in almost every account of his disappearance since. He wrote that he was going into a strange country and he did not particularly expect to come out, and then he was gone. No body was ever found, no grave, no record of death in any Mexican archive. The theories have accumulated for over a century. He was killed in the fighting, he died of natural causes, and was buried without record. He deliberately fabricated his own disappearance, which some who knew him considered entirely consistent with his character and his views on death. Bierce had written extensively about death, about disappearance, about the fine line between existence and non-existence. He had also been known to say that he considered dying in a ditch in America a considerably worse fate than dying in Mexico. Whatever happened in the weeks after that last letter, he arranged it so that no one would ever know for certain whether that was circumstance or intention. The result is the same. One of the most articulate men in America, a man who spent his career in the precise use of words, left the world without a final sentence. D.B. Cooper is the only person in American history to commit air piracy and never be caught, identified, or found. On November 24, 1971, a man using the name Dan Cooper boarded a Northwest Orient flight from Portland to Seattle. He was middle-aged, wearing a business suit, and he ordered a bourbon and soda. Shortly after takeoff, he handed a flight attendant a note that said he had a bomb. He was calm throughout. He negotiated the release of the other passengers in exchange for $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. The plane landed in Seattle. The passengers were released. The money was delivered. Cooper then instructed the crew to fly toward Mexico, somewhere over the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. At an altitude of around 10,000 feet, in the dark, in the rain, he lowered the rear stairs of the aircraft and jumped. He was never seen again. The FBI investigation that followed was one of the longest in Bureau history, running for 45 years before being officially suspended in 2016. In 1980, a small bundle of the ransom money was found on the bank of the Columbia River, partially decomposed. Nothing else was ever found. No body, no parachute, no other bills. No reliable witnesses who saw him after the jump. The man walked onto a plane, committed a federal crime with extraordinary composure, and disappeared into the night sky above a forest. And in the 50 years since, no one has been able to say with certainty who he was, whether he survived, or where he went. What these cases share is not a mechanism. They share an effect on the people who encounter them. The psychological research on missing persons cases consistently finds that unresolved disappearances produce a specific and unusually persistent form of distress in those connected to them and in the general public that follows them. The reason is something that grief researchers call ambiguous loss, a concept developed by psychologist Pauline Boss. Ambiguous loss is loss without confirmation, loss without a body, without a moment of finality, without the information necessary to close the narrative of a person's existence. The human brain processes death as an event with a before and an after. Grief moves through stages because it is tracking a narrative arc. When there is no confirmed death, the narrative arc never closes. The brain cannot file the loss as complete because the evidence does not confirm it. The missing person remains simultaneously present in memory, in hope, in the absence of contrary evidence, and absent in every practical and physical sense. This suspended state is not a lesser form of grief. Research consistently shows it is a more difficult one. The families of the missing do not grieve less than the families of the confirmed dead. They often grieve longer, with less resolution, because the story has no ending that the brain can accept and move past. The strangest thing about these 4 disappearances is not what happened. It is what did not happen. Frederick Valantic's aircraft did not leave wreckage. Brandon Swanson's fall did not make a sound. Ambrose Bierce's death did not leave a record. D.B. Cooper's landing did not leave a trace. In each case, the person reached a point of transition, and the physical world stopped providing evidence. You are present until you are not. Between those 2 states, normally there is a seam, evidence, marks, something that allows the world to account for where you went. These 4 reached that point and left no seam. And the reason these cases persist, the reason they accumulate researchers and theorists and believers and investigators across decades, is not that people expect to solve them. It is that the absence of a seam is itself unbearable. We are a species that accounts for things. We follow trails. We find explanations. We close narratives. A person who cannot be accounted for is not just a missing person. They are a hole in the fabric of what we believe the world to be. Brandon Swanson said a half word and was gone. His father kept his name, the line stayed open, and somewhere in that minute and a half of silence is the thing that makes these cases impossible to leave alone. The silence is not empty. It is the shape of an answer that was never given.